We'll just start with your thoughts on where we are with the state of the presidential race.
I think right now, pretty much everything is baked into the cake except the debates. This debate is actually one of the few debates that's really, really important. Obviously, every national poll is now within margin of error. Most of the swing state polls are also within margin of error. So while people think that's advantage Trump, and it is, given that he's running much stronger than he was in 2020, the fact is that right now, pretty much all the views about both candidates are baked into the cake. So the question for the election is going to be, is the focus on Biden or is the focus on Trump? I've said for years that when it comes to presidential elections, whoever the election becomes a referendum on typically loses. So that means that in 2012, it became a referendum, oddly enough, on Mitt Romney. He lost. In 2016, it was actually not a referendum on Trump. It was a referendum on Hillary Clinton. She lost. In 2020, it was obviously a referendum on Trump rather than Biden. He lost. In 2024, it should be a referendum on Biden. And so far, all the focus has been on what a bad President Biden is with inflation and with the foreign policy on fire. But the debate could shift all of that. Obviously, Joe Biden's intent is to ask Trump over and over and over again about 2020, election 2020, January 6th. I presume that Jake Tapper and Dana Bash will do much the same thing. It's going to be Trump's job to avoid the landmine that he likes to embrace, which is talking about himself, and instead say, listen, whatever you think happened January 6th, 2021, whatever you think happened in election 2020, the person who's been president since January 20th of 2021 has been Joe Biden, and he's been terrible, which is why no matter what you think of me, I'm now beating him in the polls. I was a better president than he is. He's a terrible president right now, like this very moment. And what matters is going to be election day 2024, not January 6th, 2021. He's going to have to really put the focus back on Biden at every possible turn. And I think he's going to have to avoid some of the kind of easy jokes that he likes to play, mainly because I think that they backfire in a room where there's no audience. So a lot of these rules in this debate are set up very much in favor of Joe Biden. This whole thing feels incredibly rigged in terms of Joe Biden offers the debate. He offers the dates and the networks. The anchors come out the same day. The rules come out the same day. That feels pre-planned to me. Donald Trump immediately picked up on that and took him up on that. I think probably Trump should have said, happy to do that. And then he should have negotiated a little bit more over the rules. But obviously the mic's being muted is a bit of a problem for Trump because he's not going to be able to kind of jump in with the pithy one-liner. It prevents him from running roughshod totally over Joe Biden, which is probably good for Trump. But by the same token, if Joe Biden flags, it would be very helpful to be able to jump in and say, Joe, what are you talking about? That'd be a useful thing. He can't do that. The lack of an audience doesn't serve Trump well because he really responds to crowds in the room. And he also is very funny, and humor doesn't fall the same way when there's no crowd in the room. So a lot of the factors are stacked against Trump. He's really going to have to kind of go within himself and perform in a way that he really has not had to perform in a debate before, I think.
I was thinking also, though, with, if Biden has one of those moments where he trails off at the end of a sentence and says, well, anyway, I think if I were President Trump, I would say, oh, no, please go ahead, finish.
Exactly. No, that is going to be the big thing. Exactly. I've been saying this on the show for a few weeks now. I really think that that's going to happen because that is what Biden did in all of his debates in 2020. And so it's now 4 years later, and he is diminished even from 2020. The possibility that 35 minutes into the debate, whatever cocktail they give him starts to wear off and he starts to fade a little bit. And he just says, well, I don't want to give my time back to the... And then Trump says, Mr. President, we all want to hear what you have to say. Go on. Yep. And then he just freezes up. Like that could be the end of the election right there. So I would very much recommend that Trump allow Biden his time. The more Biden talks, the more focus is on Joe Biden, even if what Joe Biden is saying is about Donald Trump. The problem for Biden here is that I don't think that Biden has the mode that he had in 2020, which was this sort of kindly old grandpa mode. I don't think he has that. He now comes off as either kind of fading away in sort of dementia-addled fashion or very aggressive, like he was in the State of the Union address. And that sort of angry aggression, it might work in a State of the Union when you have a bunch of people yelling at you from the crowd. But does that work in a debate with Donald Trump? I'm not sure, because what he really benefited from in 2020 was Trump's radical aggression in debate number one, where Trump came out so hot that when Biden said to him, shut up, man, like everybody kind of went, well, kind of. But if Biden is the one who comes out super hot, I think that's actually quite good for Trump. It's a very weird debate, again, because also, nobody cares about the content. It's all going to be affect all the way through. Now, a lot of this is about affect, but, in Romney-Obama, one of the big problems is that it was about content, and then you had Candy Crowley falsely fact-checking Mitt Romney, for example, in 2012. In 2016, there was some content. Here, because we know both these guys so well, it kind of feels like, you remember a few years back, there was actually a movie with Robert De Niro and Sylvester Stallone called Grudge Fight, and it was just these two old guys fighting each other. And you know them from their entire career, and it just didn't do much box office. I feel like it could be that. It could be just these two guys kind of pawing at each other and everybody being like, well, this is exactly what I thought it would be.
Yeah, and that gets to this idea that I don't like to call people who are unhappy to have these as their two candidates as the choice. And because they've been labeled as double haters. And I don't think that they're hateful. I think they're just kind of dismayed and they're frustrated and they're worried about the future of the country. But I think voters are making a logical choice. However, when you see polls tightening up as they have, I think all of us live in this world where I have friends who will say, I don't know anyone who would ever vote for Joe Biden. And on the liberal side, they have friends that say, no one I know would ever vote for President Trump, though they might have a secret Trump voter in their circle and not know about it. How do you help people understand that this is a nation that is made up of a lot of Democrats, a lot of Republicans, and many independents who will make a choice either way?
Yeah, I mean, oddly enough, this election is stacking up to be, for the first time in a while, a base election in which turnout is really the only thing that matters. I think for the first time maybe since 2012. So in 2016, independents basically decided the election was a low voter turnout election, but independents did break for Trump in the last days of the election. In 2020, independents broke against Trump and broke for Biden. On this one, because the lack of voter enthusiasm is so unbelievably palpable, it does feel like Trump does have a bit of an advantage there, because the people who love Trump will walk over broken glass to vote for him. Who exactly loves Joe Biden? Like, who is the critical base that's like, oh my God, this guy needs to be president of the United States? There may be some people on the Democratic side of the aisle who just desperately don't want Trump to be president, but even that feels like it's faded a little bit. The statistic that I keep coming back to that I think does cut in favor of Trump is that between 2016 and 2020, the number of additional voters in the voting base increased by 22 million. That is a radical increase in the number of voters in any given election. Typically, it'll move within like a 4 or 5 million vote margin. Mm-hmm. And here it moved up by 22 million votes. Well, I can't imagine all those people are going to show up again. I think that it's going to revert back to type, and you might lose 10 or 15 million voters from the last election cycle. Well, that heavy turnout benefited Joe Biden in extraordinary numbers with all the early mail-in voting. I think that for Donald Trump, again, I think the systemic advantages for Trump here are quite real. But that's only so long as everybody is focused in on Joe Biden incessantly. And that's what the debate is going to be about. It's what the rest of the race is going to be about. I think, weirdly enough, all of the factors that a lot of Trump voters, including me, are upset with regard to Trump, the I think, unfair lawsuits against him, the attempt to use the judicial system to get him in New York in what is obviously a ridiculous case, all of the social media bans originally. I think a lot of that sort of stuff actually has cut weirdly in Trump's favor because it's taken him out of the public eye. So him being in court 8 hours a day means that, you know what, he's not on cable news 8 hours a day. And him being on Truth Social means he's not on X. And the less you see of Donald Trump and the more you remember his policy, the more popular he becomes. Mm-hmm. And so, again, I think that the best thing for Trump to do here is play it pretty calm. If he plays it calm in this debate, I think that will shock a lot of people. And then just run a calm. If he runs a calm campaign, I think that Trump wins. If he runs an unhinged campaign, I think that Biden wins.
I have been thinking about the debate prep a little bit because I don't really know how Trump's debate prep is going. They're not leaking a lot of that information, and that's fine. Maybe it's more intense than they're letting on. I don't know. But I do know that I worked for a president, George W. Bush, who would never have accepted what Biden is doing. They announced 16 advisors who are there giving him advice. And there's probably more than that. And then you have Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton weighing in. And I don't think they're giving bad advice necessarily. It's just so interesting to me that there's so many people that are trying to talk to Biden. Can you imagine like all of those inputs? It would drive me nuts.
It would drive me nuts. And I'm not in stage 2 dementia. I mean, like, this is like the problem for Joe Biden here is that in a given room, how many people can he actually even listen to? And that's why I think a lot of this is phony. I think that basically it's coming down to like Tom Donilon and Ron Klain, and you got like 2 or 3 people in there, maybe Jill, who are in there, and they're kind of telling him, remember this. And that's pretty much it. Because how much information can you pour into Joe Biden's head at this point in time? And on the other side of the aisle, I think the same thing is true. I think that most of the people who are surrounding Trump, you know, they're saying he's getting like policy briefings from people. Oh, okay, sure. I mean, let's be real about this. Donald Trump was not taking policy briefings when he was at the White House. That's not how his White House actually worked. Donald Trump, like sitting there, like, he famously did not read policy papers. If you would like leave a memo on his desk, it wasn't going to get done. So the idea that he's sitting there for like an hour and a half and listening to Art Laffer walk him through modern economics is like, no, that's not what's happening. What's probably happening is that there are a lot of people having conversations like you or like I am, you know, with each other right now saying, Mr. President, if you just keep controlled, if you do that and you have like 2 or 3 good lines, you clock him once about the fact that he has low approval ratings and that he is tyrannical in his use of executive authority, well, like whatever it is, 40-year inflation, you do that over and over and over and you'll win. I think that's what the takeaway is going to be. If I were training these guys, either one of them, I'd be focused on like 2 or 3 key things for them to focus on. I certainly would not be attempting to pour mastery of the material into Joe Biden. I just don't think that's going to work.
There's one thing that really drives me crazy about what Democrats do, and Republicans are guilty of this too, but I see it a lot more as people try to defend the Biden administration right now, is they just will throw so many numbers at their debating opponent. And I have a new line for it. It's called rat-a-tat stat. And it just they just try to bury you in all of these numbers. Well, Hillary Clinton does it in her op-ed today in the New York Times. He created 15 million jobs and and it's like, but they don't talk about the stats that are actually mattering to people.
Well, I think that's right. So in debate, typically this is called gish galloping, which is where you just rattle off a bunch of stuff in a row and you don't give people a chance to respond. That's particularly likely to happen in this debate where, again, they're going to shut off Trump's mic. So if Biden just starts spouting a paragraph of stats, even if all of them are false, there's no way for Trump to kind of fact check that in real time. Plus, Trump isn't likely to fact check that in real time. The one thing I think you might see Trump do is he might do the My Cousin Vinny thing, right? Where Biden gives his opening statement and then he just looks at him and said, everything that guy just said is right. That you could see Trump do. And that would be actually quite effective. If Biden just spouts a bunch of nonsense and Trump says, it's nonsense. Yeah, everyone is living with prices 20% higher than they were when you took office. Everybody is living with gas prices 44% higher than when you took office. Wages have not kept pace with inflation. If your economy is so great, why does everybody hate your economy?
Right.
That's all he has to say. I don't think that he has to fact check him.
We had a guy on today on America's Newsroom. He's from Philadelphia. He's a small business owner, runs a small cheesesteak restaurant. And he said, when President Trump was in office, I charged $8 for a cheesesteak sandwich. Today, I have to charge people $14. And everyone feels that. Right. So, and I even think that whole numbers are always better than percentages and things like this for a mass audience. And I will tell you this, though, before we take a quick break. I'm really looking forward to this debate. On a scale of 1 to 10, Ben, how important do you think this debate is for both candidates?
Oh, my gosh. I think it's probably a 10 for both candidates. I mean, I think it's less important for Biden only in the sense that the expectations for him are so unbelievably low that as long as he doesn't physically die on the stage, I think that the media will declare him the winner. For Trump, it's really, really important only in the sense that he really needs to keep the spotlight on Biden. But yes, this is, I think, maybe the only turning point in this entire campaign short of a health crisis.
I absolutely agree. And also, you never know, things could happen, right? A surprise on the world stage could occur. And I wanted to discuss a little bit with you about the Democratic Party and even the Republican Party having a realignment. And I really feel like these white working class voters walked away from the Democrats in 2020, maybe 2016 through 2020. And now you have Hispanic and Black working class voters also saying, I'm not so sure about going forward with either Biden again or the Democratic Party. That's fascinating, and it could be seismic.
I mean, I think that's right. If you look at the polls right now, I mean, Harry Anton at CNN has been looking at the polls of Black voters, and just the astonishment is written all over his face. If these polls are even remotely accurate, Donald Trump might double his support from the last time around in the Black vote. If he does that, he wins. If you're looking at the Hispanic voting base, I mean, right now, he's basically running dead even or even ahead of Biden among Hispanics. It's hard for me to see how Biden is able to make up all of that. And it is leading to a historic shift. Again, I think that this is all the vestiges of Barack Obama's 2012 campaign. And this is my grand unifying field theory of politics in the United States over the past couple of decades. The most important election of our lifetime is the one no one cares about. 2012 was deeply important because what 2012 was an unpopular president who'd won an overwhelming victory, running for re-election, and deciding he was going to abandon moderates. He just was not going to look at moderates or independents. He was instead going to build a winning coalition on heavy voter turnout among minorities plus single white ladies. And that was Barack Obama's candidacy in 2012. And because he won, there was all this theorizing about the emerging non-white majority that was going to lift Democrats to victory for the rest of time, something John Judas was writing about, for example, Roy Teixeira. And that was the going Democratic theory. Hillary tried to double down on that in 2016, and then Biden tried to double down on it again in 2020. And I think Democrats have been trotting this weird path where they think the more radical they go, the more they're going to be able to lock up these bases. And what they're actually finding is that it turns out that's a pretty depressing message. I mean, the message that Democrats have been promoting, this sort of intersectional coalition of aggrieved victims against white supremacy or against the system or against people who have wronged you on a group basis, that doesn't even have the sort of John Edwards-like To America's charm or Bernie Sanders' charm of it's just a class-based thing. And again, I think the class-based stuff is really overstated, and I don't think that has tremendous appeal, even in the United States, because the United States is not a class-based society like Great Britain in 1820 or something. But with that said, that was a much more appealing line of attack than you are invariably a member of a particular minority group. You will be aggrieved based on your membership in this group. And when Joe Biden travels to Morehouse College and lectures the college graduates about how hard they have it and how they're never going to succeed in America without working 3 times as hard as a white guy, is that an inspiring message? Or would you rather live in America where actually it turns out if you work really hard, you can get ahead and do great? Like, that's a much more inspiring and upbeat message. I think that's actually where Trump has some significant advantages here. Again, I think the realignment, a lot of it's been laid at the feet of Trump. And he is a one-of-one, unique, interesting political figure who has been able to break through all of the usual Democratic attacks, corrupt, doesn't care about you. He's been able to do that because he's larger than life. With that said, to me, the story of modern politics is not the story of the right reorienting toward middle class, working class voters, as much as it is Democrats reorienting against those people on the basis of a sort of woke ideology. I think there's been a lot of attempts in the Republican Party to theorize and philosophize around the rise of MAGA and the rise of Trumpism and treating this as though he's a radical policy differentiation from, say, George W. Bush. And then I look at the policy and I go, I'm not really sure where I see the massive political differentiation from, say, the compassionate conservatism of George W. Bush in 2000.
Last week, when President Trump said he'd be willing to consider a policy that would staple a green card to a legal foreign exchange student graduating from a university here in America, I was like, oh, that's like, yeah, okay.
That's left of Mitt Romney in 2012. It's left of Mitt Romney in 2012.
And Orrin Hatch from the Judiciary Committee before he passed away.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. If you look at Trump on every issue, he's actually more moderate on nearly every issue than many of his predecessors. On abortion, he has said this is a states' rights issue. I'm not even getting involved at the national level. He can get away with that with the base because he's so popular with the base. He has said, I'm not going to touch entitlements, which is a much more moderate position than, say, George W. Bush circa 2005, talking about moving toward privatization of Social Security, which, by the way, we should have done. It would have solved a lot of our problems.
I know. I'm dying for someone to do this statistic for me because I can't really do the math. But if let's just say that privatization of 10%, if you choose, of your savings or had gone into the stock market or you invested it however you wanted, how much money you would have today in your account versus what is actually happening today to people's account, which is negative. One of these days, that issue is going to get solved, and it will probably look a lot like what was proposed in 2005.
100%. Well, it's the only way to solve it, because either we're going to go to austerity measures or radically increase taxes, or that will be the solve. Everyone's avoiding it. But the point is with Trump, what's really fascinating is that he's been treated as though he's an out-of-the-box politician on policy. He's not an out-of-the-box politician on policy. He's an out-of-the-box politician on rhetoric and in terms of like the size of his scope and appeal. Like, he's a larger-than-life figure in a way that I haven't seen in my lifetime, obviously. I don't think anyone has. But in terms of his actual policy, Mark Thiessen has a really good piece in the Washington Post today, talking specifically about the fact that MAGA voters are more hawkish than non-MAGA voters inside the Republican Party. They're more supportive of Israel. They're more supportive of the war against Russia in Ukraine. They're more believing in an interventionist American foreign policy. That's precisely the opposite of what you hear from many of the people who consider themselves MAGA, ultra MAGA, or whatever Biden wants to call them. And so, again, I think that one of the great lies here is that the Republican Party has moved much of anywhere on policy since like 2008, 2012. The Democratic Party has moved leagues away from where they were in 2008, 2012, and has really hurt them badly with working class voters, black, white, and green.
What's also interesting about that piece that Mark Thiessen wrote is it's based on a survey done by the Ronald Reagan Foundation. And it basically says, Republican voters or MAGA voters are not all of a sudden isolationists. Certainly Ronald Reagan was not. He made good cases for where he decided to use America's influence. Ben, I'd like in this segment to ask people, what am I missing? Like, what are you paying attention to that I might not have on my radar that you look at? Now, because I listen to you every day, I feel like I have a pretty good sense of that. And then I want to end on a question about anti-Semitism in America. But is there something that you pay attention to, whether it's a trend or maybe just conversations you have amongst people, or is there a statistic or something that you look at during a presidential election that I should be paying attention to?
Again, I think that the voter enthusiasm gap is the biggest thing, and people are paying attention to that, but there is a massive voter enthusiasm gap, and particularly in constituencies that Joe Biden really needs outsized turnout in. Obviously, I'll speak about my own constituency. American Jews are not going to turn out in mass numbers for Joe Biden. They're not. The percentages might not change all that much for American Jews between 2020 and 2024. There will just be many fewer voters in the voting population. And people in my particular segment of the Jewish community, meaning the Orthodox, are going to show up in mass numbers to vote for Donald Trump, like in huge, huge numbers to vote for Donald Trump. I think that you're going to see something similar in a lot of voting constituencies. Voter enthusiasm in this election is so low. And I think that that really does benefit Trump in a lot of ways, because again, I think that if you're low voter enthusiasm, you're likely to not vote, or maybe you're likely to vote for RFK Jr. It's interesting how the amount of focus on RFK Jr. has dropped fairly radically over the course of the last 5-6 months, when in reality, in virtually every poll, he's still picking up like 10% of the vote. I mean, that is a stand-in for, I don't want any of these people. I hate all of this. And I would bet you money that a huge number of people who are voting for RFK Jr. are disillusioned Democrat voters, or like, I can't bring myself to vote for Trump, so I suppose I'll vote for RFK Jr.
If I could then turn your attention to anti-Semitism in America, this past weekend, there were attacks on people that you could see on camera. And these are the ones that we saw, right? These are the ones that we know about. There was New York, there was Los Angeles. I am increasingly alarmed. I'm sure you and I know you and your community are. And of course, I listen to the commentary podcast every day as well, just so I can keep up on it. I feel like it is true. Like if this were happening to any other group, right, there would be alarm. And there should be alarm. And well, I actually don't even know what exactly my question is. I want you to know, one, that I myself and Fox News, I think I can speak for them, that we are on top of it from our perspective. But what else can be done? What can people listening to this podcast do to try to beat this back? Because I don't want to feel like 1938.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, look, as a Jew in America, this is not 1938. I'm not afraid that my family and I are going to get shipped on a boxcar somewhere or shot in a ditch. Mm-hmm. What I am afraid of is this rising tide on the left that is dangerous to everyone, not just Jews. Jews, it's a danger to Jews because Jews are the tip of the spear in the argument. But the argument, which is effectively that the world is divided between victims and victimizers, and that if you are successful in America, you are by nature a victimizer, and that if you are unsuccessful in America, it is because you and your group are victims. It's unbelievably dangerous to the body politic. And when that is extended to target Jews specifically, which is what is happening right now, because Jews don't fit in that box, because number one, Jews are, by the data, the most targeted minority group in America in terms of hate crimes, but also deeply successful economically, educationally, and otherwise. Because they don't fit into that box, the left has basically decided that Jews don't count anymore as a sort of victim group, and that means that they must be specifically targeted. And they're meeting hands on the far right with some weird folks who are making sort of the same sort of intersectional argument, but in terms of class. That argument, which has become, it's fringe on the right, but it's very predominant on the left. That is the thing that scares me, is that when you have a mainstream Democratic political party where the president of the United States will say, I condemn the anti-Semitism of protesters beating people up in front of a synagogue, but he won't actually condemn the ideology that leads to it. And that's the part that's really astonishing to me and really a problem. I did a podcast a little bit earlier this week talking about the rising movement inside the Democratic Party. And if you had to put money on it, do you believe the Democratic Party is going to be a moderate, pro-Jewish, somewhat pro-Israel party for the next 20 years? I wouldn't put money on that. In fact, I would say within the next 10 years, this party is going to move radically against Israel and also against Jews, because the truth is that the anti-Israel sentiment is merely a foreign policy extension of a domestic policy argument about the disproportionate power of particular groups in America. And Jews tend to be at the end of that sentence. That sort of stuff is really ugly and really hideous. As I've said, Joe Biden would be condemning Islamophobia, the evils that lead to Islamophobia, if there are a bunch of people protesting outside of a mosque because of a terrorist attack. Yeah. But if a bunch of people protest outside a synagogue and literally beat people up for the crime of trying to go inside the synagogue, then Joe Biden's like, well, that's out of control and that's really bad and that's anti-Semitic. But I have a lot of sympathy for we hear you. We hear you. I don't understand why it's necessary to say we hear you to people who truly believe that Hamas is a force for decency in the Middle East and Israel is some sort of apartheid genocidal state. That's such a delusional crazy perspective that is totally disconnected from reality. It seems to me weird that the Democratic Party still believes that it has to maintain credibility with those folks.
If I were President Biden, I would have left debate prep and I would have gone to Los Angeles. Right?
It would have been a good move for him.
I
It would have been a
stand
good
here.
move.
It would have been a good move.
Again, you know, there's
right.
no such soldier moment for these people. That's the part that's
No.
truly amazing, right? I mean,
And
1992.
they have such. In fact, Corinne Jean-Pierre on CNN over the weekend said, whenever President Biden is given an opportunity to speak to the American people, he takes it. And I was like, but you didn't even do the Super Bowl interview?
Now,
example?
Biden is asleep at the switch, and that's one of the reasons why he's suffering in the polling data. It's why the debate matters.
Yeah, it matters a lot. The last thing I wanted to ask you about is something you have coming up on the Daily Wire, which I'm very excited about. I got to view a screening of Possum Trot, which is a movie that's coming out July 4th by Angel Studios. And the story it's based on a true story of an incredible amount of love to foster and adopt kids who really needed help in Possum Trot, Texas. And I thought I'd give you a final word on that.
And it's an amazing thing. We at Daily Wire are helping out our friends over at Angel Studios, a partnership to put this in theaters. Sound of Hope obviously follows in the same series as Sound of Freedom, and it's about a community in, as you mentioned, rural Texas that adopted 77 kids out of foster care. It's inspiring and it's wonderful. And if you wish to kind of tweak the nose of left-wing Hollywood and also see a really great, inspiring movie on July 4th weekend, I really recommend you go out and see Sound of Hope.
I absolutely love the movie. I loved it. And though it made me cry from sadness for what those kids were going through, the triumph at the end of this movie, if you want to be inspired, you will watch this movie. Ben Shapiro, thank you.
Thanks, Dana.